On 21st May 1924, 14-year-old Robert Bobby Franks was abducted and killed in Chicago, Illinois. Within 10 days, two University of Chicago students, Nathan Leopold, age 19, and Richard Loeb, age 18, confessed to the crime. The case became one of the most scrutinized criminal proceedings in American legal history. If you value historical cases examined through documented record rather than dramatization, consider subscribing. Some trials are remembered for verdicts, others are remembered for what they changed. The body of Bobby Franks was discovered on 22 May near a drainage culvert along the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks in Hammond, Indiana. Identification was made quickly due to distinctive dental work. Franks was the son of a prominent Chicago businessman, and his disappearance had already prompted immediate search efforts. The investigation advanced rapidly. Leopold and Loeb were not initially suspects. Both were from affluent Chicago families and were known within academic circles for intellectual achievement. Nathan Leopold had completed college at an unusually young age and was pursuing graduate study in law. Richard Loeb was enrolled at the University of Chicago and had a documented interest in criminal fiction. Shortly after the murder, the perpetrators mailed a ransom note to the Franks family, demanding $10,000. The note had been typed, instructions were precise. However, the plan collapsed when Bobby's body was found before ransom payment could be arranged. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline of 21 May. Witnesses placed Bobby Franks walking home from school in the afternoon. He was approached and lured into an automobile. Evidence later established that Leopold and Loeb had rented the vehicle under an assumed name. The investigation turned decisively when a pair of eyeglasses was found near the body. The frames were traced to a limited production model sold in Chicago. Records connected them to Nathan Leopold. When questioned, Leopold initially claimed he had lost the glasses during a birdwatching excursion. The explanation was inconsistent with documented rental car usage and alibi statements. As scrutiny intensified, inconsistencies between Leopold and Loeb's accounts became evident. Police reconstructed their movements on the afternoon of the crime. Both young men were questioned repeatedly. On 31st May 1924, confronted with mounting evidence, they confessed. Their stated motive was not financial necessity or personal grievance. They described a desire to commit what they considered a perfect crime. During interrogation, they portrayed the act as an intellectual exercise rather than an emotional reaction. This framing contributed significantly to public shock. The press quickly characterized the killing as a thrill murder. Headlines emphasized youth, education, and wealth. The case appeared to challenge assumptions about criminality and class. Unlike many homicide defendants of the era, Leopold and Loeb were not products of economic deprivation. Public interest intensified when discussions of philosophical influence emerged. Leopold had previously expressed admiration for aspects of Friedrich Nietzsche's writings. Some commentators argued that a misinterpretation of Nietzsche's concept of the Bermensch had influenced the crime. Others cautioned against simplistic causal attribution. The philosophical debate soon became embedded within public discourse, though it remained tangential to the legal proceedings. The defendants' families retained Clarence Darrow, already one of the most prominent defense attorneys in the United States. Darrow faced a strategic decision. Rather than contesting guilt before a jury, he entered guilty pleas on behalf of both defendants. The case would proceed directly to sentencing before Judge John R. Cavally. This maneuver altered the structure of the trial. Without a jury to determine guilt, the proceeding focused on punishment. Illinois law permitted the death penalty for murder. Darrow's objective was to persuade the court to impose life imprisonment rather than execution. The early days of the case established several defining features: rapid investigative resolution, full confessions, intense media scrutiny, and the involvement of nationally recognized legal counsel. What followed would extend beyond the specifics of the crime itself. The confessions of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb did not conclude the public reaction to the murder of Bobby Franks. They intensified it. Within days of their admission of guilt, newspapers across the United States were publishing extensive accounts of the defendants' backgrounds, correspondence, and intellectual interests. The case moved from local homicide to national debate. Chicago in 1924 was a city accustomed to organized crime and gang-related violence. Yet the Franks murder diverged from prevailing patterns. The defendants were neither impoverished nor associated with criminal enterprises. They were university students from established families. This contrast unsettled assumptions about the sources of criminal behavior. The prosecution prepared to pursue the death penalty. State's Attorney Robert E. Crowe announced publicly that execution would be sought. Under Illinois law, a jury could impose capital punishment upon conviction for murder. The brutality of the act and the youth of the victim intensified calls for retribution. The defense, led by Clarence Darrow, pursued a different strategy. Rather than contesting the factual record, Darrow entered guilty pleas for both Leopold and Loeb on 27 July 1924. This decision removed the jury from the process. Sentencing would be determined solely by Judge John R. Cavalli. The choice reflected careful calculation. A jury trial risked capital punishment influenced by public outrage. A bench sentencing allowed Darrow to present mitigating arguments grounded in psychology and social theory rather than emotional appeal. Central to the defense was the introduction of psychiatric testimony. Darrow assembled a panel of medical experts, including prominent psychiatrists and neurologists, to evaluate the defendants. Over several weeks, the court heard extensive testimony regarding personality development, childhood influences, and mental condition. The defense experts described Leopold and Loeb as emotionally immature and psychologically unstable despite their academic achievement. They cited obsessive tendencies, grandiosity, and moral detachment. The argument advanced was not legal insanity in the strict statutory sense. Rather, it was diminished moral development shaped by environmental and psychological factors. The prosecution challenged these characterizations. State experts and cross-examinations questioned the extent to which psychological explanations mitigated deliberate planning. Evidence presented in court demonstrated calculated preparation, the rental of a vehicle under an assumed name, purchase of equipment, drafting of ransom correspondence, and selection of a victim known to one of the defendants. The Nietzsche debate entered public discussion during this phase. Leopold had expressed admiration for certain philosophical ideas in personal correspondence, including references to individual exceptionalism. Newspapers framed these references as ideological justification for the crime. Darrow, however, avoided endorsing philosophy as causation. He emphasized emotional development rather than intellectual doctrine. Scholars later noted that the public treatment of Nietzsche's work during the trial often simplified complex philosophical concepts into direct behavioral influence. Within the courtroom, the argument centered less on abstract philosophy and more on psychological predisposition and youth. The age of the defendants became a focal point. At 19 and 18, Leopold and Loeb were legally adults. Yet, Darrow argued that neurological and moral development continued beyond chronological majority. The defense presented their youth as a mitigating factor warranting life imprisonment rather than death. Public reaction was divided. Editorial pages reflected tension between deterrence and mercy. Some commentators argued that execution was necessary to affirm moral boundaries. Others viewed capital punishment as excessive in light of the defendant's age and the absence of prior violent history. The courtroom proceedings extended over several weeks. Psychiatric experts testified at length. Cross-examinations probed contradictions. Observers noted the unprecedented duration of expert testimony in a sentencing context. The trial became a forum not only for determining punishment, but for examining theories of criminal causation. Meanwhile, the families of both defendants faced scrutiny. Wealth and social position became part of the narrative. Critics suggested that resources enabled strategic legal maneuvering unavailable to less affluent defendants. Darrow's reputation and experience reinforced perceptions of disparity within the justice system. The prosecution maintained that the calculated nature of the crime warranted the severest penalty. Planning had been deliberate. The victim had been chosen with forethought. The defendant's intelligence, the state argued, demonstrated awareness of consequences rather than incapacity. The defense countered that execution would neither restore the victim nor advance justice. Darrow framed the issue as a question of societal progress. Capital punishment, he suggested, reflected reactive impulse rather than enlightened governance. As testimony concluded, attention turned to Darrow's closing argument. Unlike a jury summation, this address would be directed solely to Judge Caverly. The stakes were clear. The court could impose death by hanging or sentence the defendants to life imprisonment. The escalation phase of the Leopold and Loeb case thus moved beyond factual guilt. It became an examination of youth, psychology, philosophy, and the role of capital punishment within modern legal systems. The crime itself was no longer contested. The central question was what society should do in response. By August 1924, the Leopold and Loeb proceedings had shifted entirely to the question of punishment. The defendants had entered guilty pleas. There would be no jury deliberation on guilt. Instead, Judge John R.O. Caverly of the Cook County Criminal Court would determine whether Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb would be sentenced to death or to life imprisonment. The sentencing phase became the defining moment of the case. Clarence Darrow's strategy centered on the elimination of capital punishment. Rather than appealing to emotional sympathy, he constructed an argument grounded in psychology, youth, and the social implications of execution. His summation extended over 12 hours across 2 days, making it one of the longest closing arguments in American legal history. Darrow did not contest the brutality of the crime. He acknowledged its severity. His emphasis was on causation rather than denial. He argued that Leopold and Loeb were shaped by factors beyond simple moral choice: upbringing, psychological abnormality, intellectual isolation, and immaturity. He contended that execution would serve no corrective purpose. Central to Darrow's argument was the idea that society bore partial responsibility for the conditions that shaped the defendants. He cited expert testimony regarding emotional development and mental state. He described youth as a period marked by instability and susceptibility to distorted reasoning. Though legally adults, he argued, they were not fully formed in judgment. Darrow also addressed the broader philosophical context. While the press had amplified references to Nietzsche, Darrow reframed the issue as misapplied intellectual abstraction rather than coherent doctrine. He suggested that fragments of philosophical language had been absorbed without ethical grounding. The implication was not that philosophy caused the crime, but that intellectual arrogance combined with immaturity had distorted perception. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney Robert E. Crowe, rejected mitigation. Crowe emphasized deliberation and calculation. The defendants had rented a vehicle under false identification, drafted ransom correspondence, and selected a victim. These actions demonstrated foresight and awareness of consequence. The state argued that intelligence heightened culpability rather than diminished it. Crowe framed the matter as deterrence. Execution, he asserted, would affirm the seriousness of premeditated murder and uphold the rule of law. He maintained that the defendants' social privilege should not shield them from the ultimate penalty. The courtroom atmosphere during Darrow's argument was restrained, yet intense. Observers noted the absence of theatrical flourish. Darrow spoke deliberately, at times quietly, addressing the judge rather than a jury. His appeal was to judicial reflection rather than popular sentiment. He urged the court to consider history's judgment of capital punishment. He questioned whether the state should replicate violence in response to violence. He invoked the possibility that future generations might view execution as excessive. The argument extended beyond the defendants and into broader ethical territory. Judge Cavalier's responsibility was singular. Without a jury, he bore sole authority for sentencing. He reviewed psychiatric testimony, prosecution evidence, and legal precedent. Illinois law permitted capital punishment, but did not mandate it in cases where mitigating factors were found persuasive. On 10 September 1924, Judge Cavalier delivered his decision. He sentenced both Leopold and Loeb to life imprisonment for murder and an additional 99 years for kidnapping. The cumulative structure ensured that release would be unlikely in the foreseeable future. In his remarks, Judge Cavalier cited the defendant's youth as a significant factor. He acknowledged the gravity of the crime but concluded that execution was not warranted. The decision reflected measured reasoning rather than endorsement of defense theory. It was not an exoneration of responsibility, it was a determination of penalty. Public reaction was divided. Some newspapers criticized the ruling as lenient. Others commended it as enlightened. The case became a reference point in debates about capital punishment, particularly concerning young offenders. The structural confrontation of the Leopold and Loeb case did not revolve around contested facts. It revolved around competing visions of justice. The prosecution advocated retribution and deterrence. The defense argued for restraint and recognition of developmental factors. The judge selected imprisonment over execution, setting a precedent that resonated beyond Chicago. The outcome also influenced legal strategy in future capital cases. Darrow's approach, entering guilty pleas to avoid jury exposure and focusing on sentencing mitigation, became a model studied by defense attorneys in subsequent decades. The trial concluded with sentences imposed, but the case's cultural and legal implications continued to evolve. The defendants would serve years in prison under public scrutiny. One would later be killed while incarcerated. The other would eventually be released after decades. After sentencing on 10 September 1994, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were transferred to the Illinois State Penitentiary at Joliet. Their punishment, life imprisonment for murder plus 99 years for kidnapping, effectively removed the possibility of early release. The decision had spared them execution, but ensured prolonged confinement under public attention. Imprisonment did not conclude public interest. The case remained a reference point in discussions of capital punishment, youth culpability, and psychological mitigation. Newspapers continued to report on the defendants' prison conduct. Their education and social standing, once sources of public fascination, became part of ongoing scrutiny. Within prison, both men pursued academic activity. Leopold in particular devoted significant time to study and correspondence. Reports from correctional authorities described generally orderly behavior. However, confinement did not eliminate conflict. On 28 January 1936, Richard Loeb was killed inside the prison. Official accounts stated that he was attacked by another inmate during an altercation. The incident was investigated internally. Authorities concluded that the attack occurred during a dispute within the prison environment. Loeb's death closed his personal chapter of the case, but did not resolve its broader implications. Nathan Leopold remained incarcerated. Over the years, he petitioned for clemency. His conduct record and participation in educational programs were cited in support of review. After serving 33 years, Leopold was granted parole in 1958. The Illinois Parole Board considered factors including age at the time of the crime, institutional behavior, and the length of time served. Upon release, Leopold relocated to Puerto Rico. He lived under a lower public profile, working in hospital administration and participating in community activities. His release prompted renewed debate, Some viewed parole as consistent with the mitigating reasoning articulated at sentencing. Others regarded it as insufficiently punitive given the nature of the original crime. Leopold died in 1971. His later life, while removed from Chicago, remained inseparable from the case that had defined his youth. The enduring legacy of the Leopold and Loeb case rests in several institutional domains. First, it occupies a significant place in the history of capital punishment in the United States. Clarence Darrow's sentencing argument became a foundational example of anti-death penalty advocacy. His emphasis on psychological development and social causation influenced subsequent defense strategies in capital cases. The decision to enter guilty pleas to avoid jury exposure has been studied in legal scholarship as a tactical model. Second, the case contributed to evolving discussion about youth and criminal responsibility. Though both defendants were legally adults, their age became central to mitigation. The argument that neurological and emotional development extends beyond formal adulthood would later appear in broader legal debates concerning juvenile sentencing. Third, the trial reinforced the role of psychiatric testimony in criminal proceedings. Expert witnesses provided detailed assessments of personality and development. While the court did not accept insanity as a defense, it considered psychological factors in determining punishment. The integration of psychiatric evaluation into sentencing hearings became more common in later decades. The Nietzsche debate, often emphasized in public retellings, represents another dimension of legacy. During the trial, philosophical influence was treated cautiously within courtroom argument. Outside the courtroom, however, simplified interpretations flourished. Over time, the case became associated with misapplied intellectualism. Scholars have since emphasized that philosophical writings cannot be reduced to direct behavioral causation. The episode illustrates how public discourse can detach ideas from context. Culturally, the Leopold and Loeb case inspired numerous books, essays, and fictional adaptations. Its narrative privileged youth, calculated planning, and a dramatic sentencing argument proved compelling, yet institutional record remains narrower than later portrayals. The crime was premeditated. The defendants confessed. The court imposed imprisonment rather than execution. Those facts anchor the case within legal history. The case also underscores tension between retribution and rehabilitation. Judge Cavalier's decision reflected judicial restraint. It neither minimized the severity of the act nor endorsed execution as the sole response. The sentence of life imprisonment plus 99 years balanced punishment with the possibility, however distant, of future review. In retrospect, the structural significance of the case lies less in the crime itself than in the judicial reasoning that followed. Darrow's argument did not absolve responsibility. It reframed consequence. The court's acceptance of life imprisonment established a reference point for future capital sentencing discussions. Nearly a century later, the Leopold and Loeb case remains part of the American legal curriculum. It is cited in studies of criminal psychology, capital punishment jurisprudence, and defense strategy. Its endurance reflects the intersection of intellect, privilege, and law. Some crimes are remembered for violence alone. Others are remembered because they compel examination of how justice responds. The murder of Bobby Franks shocked Chicago in 1924. The sentencing that followed ensured the case would continue to shape legal discourse long after the headlines faded. The verdict was not contested. The punishment was not reversed. Yet, the debate it generated continues, quietly embedded in the broader history of American criminal law.